heading south of the Mason-Dixon. This is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Welcome back to the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. This is your host, Brian McClanahan, and this is episode 344, covering the week of February 13th through February 17th, 2023. Glad to have you back on the program. Very glad to be here. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter, like our Gab and Facebook pages, and subscribe to our YouTube page. The YouTube page really is invaluable. We have a lot of great material there, including many of our past lectures from conferences and other things, plus our podcast and our Abbeville U videos, So a lot of good stuff out there on the YouTube channel. Of course, if you go to abbevilleinstitute.org, that's ABBEVILLE, institute.org. If you give us an email address, we'll give you a free ebook, Exploring the Southern Tradition, by 20 Abbeville Institute scholars. It's a gift, again, free of charge. Just give us that email address, and that is the best way we can keep in touch with you. So if you do like everything we do, our conferences, our podcasts, our articles on the website, our Zoom webinars, all of that stuff, that's the best way to pick up those things. And, of course, we do exist on your generous contributions alone. So please consider a donation. You can donate right through the website. You can donate monthly, annually, or a one-time gift. And all of that does help support the Institute. It is tax deductible to the full extent of the law, so consider making that tax deductible donation. Also want to remind you that our 20th anniversary conference is coming up in April 13th through 16th, 2023. It's at Callaway Gardens in Pine Mountain, Georgia. It's a beautiful location. It's a nice resort. We have a lot of great speakers. We've almost finalized our list of speakers, and we will be putting that out there so you can certainly see what we're doing and make your plans to come on out. We do want you to come. So going out to abbevilleinstitute.org, again, click on the events tab and you can get all the information you need about that and come on out and see us at our 20th. Also, don't forget about those Zoom webinars or the old Zoom webinars that we have. We have some of those at abbevilleacademy.org that you can purchase there, the older webinars that we did, and they're all great. So you want to get those. And also download our free mobile app, which is, again, free of charge to you. Of course, donations do help make that free of charge to you, but just go to your app store on your mobile device and get the app. It is, again, a great way to keep up with the Institute on the go. All right, well, let's talk about the material for the week. We had some really good stuff this week, and of course, it is February 17th as I'm recording this, and that is the day that Sherman burned Columbia, South Carolina. And we actually had a piece on Sherman this week. So I want to start there and then work backwards. And this piece was by Valerie Protopappas, and the title is Getting the Truth Out There. And it talks about an exchange she had with a major website. It was HNet. It was HNet. 2008, she had an exchange with one of the editors there. And there was a book review that piqued her interest, and of course it had some establishment nonsense in it, and Miss Protopappas corrected the individual who wrote the review, and the editor responded with this. Miss Protopappas, given that the American Civil War still arouses strong feeling, I'm going to have to ask that you try to defang the tone of your post a bit, as well as provide some citation for allegations of widespread Union atrocities. This should allow the ensuing discussion to stay scholarly in nature. And so this was Scott Hendricks. Now, I don't know who Scott Hendricks is. I never heard of him before. So let's see if he has some. He teaches at Carroll University. He is a professor of history at Carroll University. And so he was the HNet editor. Now, I don't know if he still is the HNet editor or not, but he does have a full-time teaching position. And he got a PhD at the University of Tennessee. Now, he teaches primarily medieval history, Reformation history, world history, and Middle Eastern history, and all of his books are focusing on essentially European history. And so this is actually something that you see a lot, and it's a nice example of what you find in some of these publications that put out information about the war. A few years back, there was a op-ed somewhere about the South and the Confederacy, and it was written by a historian with a PhD who specialized in Latin American history, but this person knew all about the war and the South. Now, that doesn't mean that people with fields of study outside of the American South can't know about these things and, of course, publish about them, particularly in popular publications or write op-eds. But the fact is that you have people out of the field oftentimes writing this kind of drivel, or you have people that are not specialists at all. I mean, they don't have any credentials whatsoever. And again, that doesn't mean they don't know things. We have a lot of people who aren't credentialed writing for us too, but they write a lot about these topics. And so they have a lot to say about these things. Ms. Protopappas doesn't have a PhD, but she writes a lot about the war, and she has produced a full-length book on Confederate military history, at least one aspect of it. So it's not that we have people that know about these things, but Dr. Hendricks thought it was necessary to essentially insert himself into this debate. And so Ms. Protopappas responded to Dr. Hendricks with a very long list of all the things that Sherman had done in his own words, that were rather abusive of the South. And of course, we have today, again, the anniversary of Sherman's burning of Columbia in 1865. We're almost, just a couple years. We will be at the 160th anniversary of that. So it's amazing how these people don't really get it. I mean, we got to defang you. You can't make anything that would be controversial in any statements. And this is a beautiful list of all the atrocities that Sherman's men, I even say all, some of the atrocities that Sherman's men committed in the South. And so to try to patronize someone, we're going to defang you, and you got to have citations. You can't just say these things. It shows you where the profession is. Anything that is pro-Southern, or anything that would be considered to be outside the mainstream, well, you got to have all the receipts. You got to make sure you cite everything, and that is actually instructive. When you go out and you make statements, try to have as many receipts as possible. Well, what about this? What about this? And then show where you're getting it from. Now, oftentimes the people who disagree with you are going to say, well, I've read that, I know that, that's just lost cause nonsense. You see, they try to flippantly disregard it because of who wrote it. That's a simple logical fallacy of attack on the person. They're not really dealing with the material itself. They're dealing with the person that wrote it, or they're trying to dismiss it or appeal to authority in some way. This person says this. That would be a historian today. And those are all logical fallacies. Anyone that takes a logical fallacy class, a class in logic, would understand these logical fallacies. It's elementary stuff, but this is generally what you get and the pushback you get from the mainstream when you do provide receipts and you start showing what Sherman actually said. And I think Ms. Protopappas does a fantastic job in this piece of pointing out Sherman in his own words. Now, of course, people would say that, well, some of this is cherry-picked. Sherman didn't really agree with this, or this, but actions speak louder than words. We know what Sherman's army did. We know what it did in Georgia. We know what it did in South Carolina. And so it doesn't really matter what Sherman even said about things. We know what Sherman's army did. And, of course, a great book on this topic, if you want to get it, is War Crimes Against Southern Civilians by Walter Bryan Cisco. It's fantastic. Again, it provides the receipts. This war, and you get to the end of the war, 64 and 65 in particular, though you could even go back into North Alabama before that and some parts of Virginia, but this war was a war on civilians. You go into Vicksburg and of course in down the Mississippi River in the 1863. I mean, this war was a war on civilians. It was to take the war to the civilian population. And there's actually a story about this. Grant walking into Vicksburg and seeing all the factories still working and operating as they were if the Union Army wasn't there. And Grant said that this had to change. We had to shut all this down. We had to essentially starve out and force the civilian population to not support the Confederacy. They had to be subjugated. And Sherman said the same thing. You have to go to war with the civilian population. It's necessary. And so early on in the war, you could say that there was, at least policy-wise in the Union government and, of course, in the Union military, an effort to not harass Southern civilians and not harm Southern property. But that changed very quickly within about a year. You went to a much more concerted effort to destroy Southern property and make it unusable for the Confederacy. And of course, also go in and steal things and do whatever you had to do to ensure that the Southern civilian population could not wage war. And again, there's only one section in the United States ever that's been subjected to this, and that's the South. Now, you could say, well, what about during the American War for Independence? You had New York City burned. You had some efforts in New England even to try to abuse the population there by the British. But definitely in New York, there was a lot going on. Of course, we know that did happen. But as a whole, in an entire section of the United States, an entire population, the South is the only one that's ever really been subjected to this. And even during the American War for Independence, you had this in the South. So the South suffered in two major wars. The North, really, except for New York and a few instances here outside of New York, nothing in the United States. Nothing. I mean, you could say, maybe Hawaii during World War II or New York City during 9/11. But again, very limited incidents compared to the wholesale destruction of the South. And I say wholesale, I mean it. Wholesale economic destruction, wholesale political destruction, wholesale social destruction. And that's a nice segue into the piece that Rod O'Barr wrote about, the title is What Shall We Do with the Blacks? Because the black population of the South was also greatly affected by the war. Kirkpatrick Sale wrote a really interesting book several years ago entitled Emancipation Hell. And everyone that reads that, or looks at the title, I should say, thinks that Sale is going to be pro-slavery. Sale is the furthest thing from that. But what he points out, and I think even what some mainstream historians have finally come around to realizing, even people like Eric Foner, that it was emancipation that really created many of the problems we're seeing, or we saw in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And maybe even that's the legacy that has been handed down and created all the issues in the United States with so many things. But when it comes to race relations and the problems that we see on that particular topic in the United States, because the Union government didn't really have a policy except for root hog or die with former slaves. There wasn't anything that they had come up with that would alleviate the problems that slaves that were coming off the plantations. They didn't have any education, any money, any property. What little money they had, and they did have some. I mean, look, some slaves did have money. This is well documented. Even if you go out and read Eugene Genovese or Fogel and Engerman, they talk about how slaves were able to acquire some property. But in terms of property that was going to be useful long term, they didn't have much of it. And so you had these large contraband camps, large camps of slaves, former slaves, that were put into these essentially concentration camps. The conditions were horrible. In fact, if you read the Jim Downs book, Sick from Freedom, you get a nice look at how the Union government treated African Americans in the South. And essentially it was for a labor force, and those that weren't well enough to do that, they just put them in the concentration camp so they could get disease and die. That was it. We know that there was a nice example where slaves were drowned trying to follow the Union Army. They tried to cross the river, and the Union Army just let them drown. So you had a concerted policy by the United States government not to do anything to help slaves. It was awful. And this is why Alexander Stephens asked Abraham Lincoln at Hampton Roads, what are we going to do with the slaves? Well, they can root hog or die. That was Lincoln's response. And Stephens was shocked by this because these were people to them. I mean, even if you have a situation where you have an unequal society, which you did in the South, and I say unequal, where you had power and slaves. You had those that were in power and those that were a slave labor population. Southerners still consider these people to be people. And you see it in their case law. Marshall DeRosa has started doing some really good work on this. And I don't know, he's working on a book, and I don't know where that is or if it'll ever come out, but he's worked on case law. And we've published some of the material on the website about that before. But to show that slaves were treated as human beings in Confederate courts. And I say Confederate courts, these were state courts under the Confederate governments. And we didn't have a federal court system for the Confederacy, but they were treated as human beings. And you saw that even in the antebellum period in the South, where you had slaves go before courts and were acquitted of crimes, even against white Southerners, because the evidence did not support the charge. What happens? Of course, emancipation happens, and then you get a major disruption. And you have, as Eric Foner wrote a little book entitled Nothing But Freedom, and he points this out in that book. You had a major disruption. Former Confederate General Richardson said slaves have nothing but freedom, and Foner agreed. But now Foner's position was they should have been given all kinds of stuff. Richardson's position was that they have nothing but freedom, so they should be put back into labor situation. But regardless, these people were pawns in a big game, and the big game was political power. And it's Hiram Revels figured this out. In Mississippi, the first African-American elected in Mississippi to the United States Senate. He bolted the Republican Party because he figured out how corrupt the Grant administration was, how corrupt the Republicans were in Mississippi, and that blacks were being used as pawns only. And it was very hard for them to have anything because of this back and forth between Democrats and Republicans in these states. And the real people that suffered in that, of course, was the civilian population of the South, white and black. This is a very awful situation, and people don't realize how bad it really was. And nowadays, you get the response, well, they all deserved it. These people are all traitors. But what about black Southerners who also lost their homes, had places blown up and burned out, and everything else? I mean, it was gone. Some of them went back to the plantations. This is documented just because they needed a place to go live. They had nothing. And so they went back to the plantation and stayed on the plantations. There's a lot of evidence of that, where you had slaves that were not going out and following the Union Army around. They stayed on the plantations because at least there they had some rudimentary care. They had some food, they had shelter, they had clothing. They had things on the plantation. And so they stayed. You can understand why they wouldn't want to. They want to test their freedom. They want to be free. But they stayed on the plantations because of the care. And there was some discussion among Union soldiers and organizers that these people didn't really want to work for wages. Wages meant nothing. They didn't want money. What they wanted was some food and some shelter, because that's the labor situation that they had for their entire life. Having a salary, having a wage meant nothing to these people, because then you had to pay. You didn't have anything else. And so the paternalistic slave system, the cradle-to-grave welfare system that had developed in the South, was what they wanted out of labor. And when they couldn't get that anymore, they really stopped working. It's, again, documentation after documentation of the Union Army abusing Southern blacks because they viewed them as a wage situation. They could get unlimited labor out of these people, and eventually they said, no, that's not how we do it. So you have a lot of things going on here, and this Rado Barr piece really does get into the poor policies the Union government had when it came to slaves in the South during the war in the postbellum period. And that actually works into Clyde Wilson's piece on Monday, America's Real Peculiar Institution. This is a lecture that he gave back in 2005 at one of our summer schools. And it corresponds nicely with the Republican. It's about the Republican Party. One thing that people don't realize, this term peculiar institution, and Clyde points out at the beginning of the piece, he didn't mean it was odd, but it was unique to the South. By that point, it was peculiar to the South. Like you said, cod fishing was peculiar to the North. But one thing that's fascinating about that, if you go back and read Jefferson, this is, of course, before Calhoun saying that slavery was a peculiar institution. If you go back and read Jefferson, he called Northerners peculiar. He did. He called them peculiar. In the late 18th century, he called Northerners peculiar and basically a strange group of people, and they had their own peculiar culture, because everyone recognized that. The real peculiar people in American history were not Southerners who were dominating America. And people like them. Jeffersonians dominated America. It's one of the things we talk a lot about on this show. We have talked about over the years. We started this in 2015. here we are near 8 years later, is that the South really was America. Something I haven't said in a long time, but the South really was America in the antebellum period. And Northerners couldn't stand it. They couldn't stand it at all. You have people like Charles Sumner promoting Make New England America or Make America New England, because he understood that the real driving force in America for most of its history to that point in the 1850s was the South. Out of the first five presidents, 4 were Southerners. And then even after that, when you look at, and you have John Quincy Adams, you have John Adams and John Quincy Adams bookending, of course, the Virginia dynasty. But then you get Andrew Jackson, another Southerner. And then you get Martin Van Buren, who was a New Yorker, but was still very much supported by the South, and he was a Jeffersonian. He had some different views than Southerners on some issues, but in terms of how the federal government operated, he was very much a Jeffersonian. Then, of course, you get William Henry Harrison, who was, by birth, a Southerner. Then John Tyler, who was a Southerner. Then you get James K. Polk, who was a Southerner. Then you get Zachary Taylor, who was a Southerner. You see how much the South has influenced the United States. Then you get to the 1850s, and while you get Millard Fillmore, you have Franklin Pierce, who had Jefferson Davis in his cabinet, and Jefferson Davis and Franklin Pierce were very good friends. And Pierce, even though Pierce is from New England, he was very much a Jeffersonian. He, in his mindset, had a Southern mindset. Same thing you could argue with James Buchanan in some ways. So you can understand how these New Englanders were really upset about the direction of the United States for the first 80 years of American history with very little reprieve. You had Southerners in a Jeffersonian worldview dominating the government. Even when Zachary Taylor gives his inaugural address, and here's a man that was a Whig, and he is, of course, from the South. He's Virginia first and then over into Louisiana, but his inaugural address is very Jeffersonian in a lot of ways. These people loved the Jeffersonian vision of America. And so that dominated. Now you can say that, well, Lincoln was trying to push the Jefferson. Lincoln never pushed the Jeffersonian image. Some of the ways that he would refer back to things and use previous inaugural addresses, he did that, right? His Lincoln's second inaugural address is in some ways almost a copy, at least near the end, of Jefferson's second inaugural address. So you could say Lincoln was trying to be Jeffersonian, he just didn't pull it off. Jefferson's position was conciliatory in both of his inaugural addresses in dealing with what he called malcontents in the North because he thought they were a real problem. But the Republican Party was peculiar. The Republican Party was odd in American history, and it still is in many ways. It's an odds institution. It comes out of New England, the odd section, or at least the New England-influenced area of the Midwest, which is an odd place. And it then foists its entire vision on the United States through war. Through war, not because they could win elections. There's no war, the Republican Party disappears. It's gone because no one would have supported it. This is the amazing thing about all this that people don't often pay attention to. The Republican Party would have disappeared if the South had been able to leave the Union and the United States actually stayed. You didn't have all the southern states seceding because you would have had Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee. These states would have stayed in the Union. You had 7 states out of the Union in 1861. If Lincoln doesn't go to war, doesn't push for war, because he pushed for war with the South. If we just accept secession, Lincoln is a one-term president and the Republicans lose in the next election. Or if the United States had accepted the Crittenden Compromise, which, of course, Lincoln was arguing behind the scenes against, if that had actually happened, then we have a situation where the Republican Party is definitely defeated and goes down in flames in 1862 and then 1864. It ceases to exist because the slavery extension issue was off the table. The common property issue, more than anything else, as Southerners pointed out, bringing a slave from one state to another doesn't expand the institution. It just takes slaves from one state to another. Jefferson made this point over and over again. It's not expansion. It is removing one to another. And I think that's Jefferson Davis said these things. You weren't expanding the institution. You were, in many ways, Jefferson looked at it as eliminating the institution. It was diffusion, and eventually it would go away. Because a slave would have been a slave in, say, Mississippi, as they would have been a slave in Arizona. You've just taken one from one place and moved it to another. You didn't replace it by bringing in a new slave. So it wasn't anything but expansion, and that, of course, that diffusion in Jefferson's mind, and I think in a lot of Southerners' minds, would have eventually led to the elimination of the institution. It would have provided, say, a safety valve for it. Now, the Republican Party wanted to bottle it up, and they thought that's how you eliminate the institution. You bottle it up in the South, and you keep everybody there, and then, of course, ultimately it will go away. I'm not so certain that would happen. I think the diffusion argument actually has more merit than bottling it up, because it was prosperous. I mean, people were making a lot of money in the South on cotton and sugar and other things, and I'm not so certain it would have gone away just because you bottle it up somewhere. Now, if you had actually gone through like the Union government did and emancipate the way they did, well, then, of course, that is going to, again, eliminate the institution. But the South was never allowed to deal with this in any way that would have mitigated the problems of emancipation. And that was all on the backs of the Republican Party. It was their policy. The way that the United States worked after 1865 was all Republican Party policies. So if you have poor conditions for slaves, that was because the Republican Party did that. If you have impoverished white Americans, it's because the Republican Party did that. If you have concentration camps for former slaves, it's because the Republican Party did that. If you have this growth in the state capitalist industrial America, it's because the Republican Party did that. The Republican Party, the finger should point back at the Republican Party for anything that happened post-1865 in America. Anything that would be in terms of economics, politics, social, all of this stuff goes back to the Republican Party, because the Democrats had no real opposition again until about the 1880s, when you started to see it. And then even there, it was limited. And then, of course, progressivism takes hold of both parties, and they both become progressives. And that is right out of the North, right? So if you want to see what New England's America looks like, just look at where we live right now. We're in New England's America with all of the good and all the bad. Whatever you think is good in it, whatever you think is bad in it, it's right out of New England. It doesn't matter what people say about the South having this overemphasis and over-representation in government. They might have controlled some things for a while in terms of the Congress and how legislation went through, but for the most part, what you're seeing in the United States is the result of New England's America, good and bad. And so I think that has to be said. In the antebellum period, the South was America. Now, I will say this, in terms of culture and what people think about American culture, still, a lot of it comes out of the South. Even when you look at Western culture, that's Southern influenced. All of that. Cowboys, that's all Southern influenced. So when you look at what is American culture and what people would recognize as American culture around the world, for a long time, it was Southern dominated. Now, the pop culture we're seeing now and what people would think the United States exports is not really Southern anymore. It's coming out of the West Coast or out of urban areas in the United States. But for a long time, it was the South. And so I find, again, that people don't really think about these things, but the Republican Party was the real peculiar institution. This is a great lecture, and it actually piggybacks on one that we had last week about Lincoln's efforts to suppress dissent during the war in northern cities and states. Now, we had a couple other pieces this week. Of course, February 14th was Valentine's Day, and there was a piece by Mark Andrew Holachek on Jefferson, a Jefferson-style love letter. And this is an interesting little piece in that it gets into Jefferson as a very poor romanticist. Jefferson, when his wife died, he never remarried. And, of course, that would be one of the accusations with the Hemmings affair, that he never remarried, and so he focused on his slave population. But Jefferson did have interest in a French woman, and he was just very clumsy in romantic issues, and he was clumsy before that. It was often known that Jefferson was a clumsy courter. And so this is a nice little piece about Jefferson being Jefferson when it came to wooing a woman in France. And then the last piece of the week, The Gift, another one by Brandon Meeks. Really good, a nice little story about a dog and what a dog means for a man and what a dog means for your happiness and your soul. And it's a nice little piece of Southern literature. I like it when we publish these things. Brandon Meeks writes very, very well. Great short stories. And this piece about his dog is no different. It was a rescue dog, a stray dog that he just showed up starving. He took care of the dog, and now it's something that just gives him a lot of joy and happiness in his life. And you find that a lot with animals and what they'll bring to you. Southerners have always loved it. I mean, John Randolph of Roanoke used to bring his dogs to the Congress. So that was not always well received, but he would do it because he loved his dogs. All right. A lot of great stuff this week again, and thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you next week. See you then.